Welcome to WWII. Today, 80 years ago, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, kicking off World War II, the largest, most devastating war in all of human history. So I thought today would be a good opportunity to talk about World War II and the mythology that sprung up around it, and the misrepresentations of this war that you see in popular portrayals. In popular portrayals, World War II is seen as this Manichaean struggle, good versus evil, allies versus the Axis powers, and although many lives were lost along the way, in the end, good triumphs, and this war, although exceedingly bloody, is eventually a success. So obviously I'm not suggesting that things would have gone better if Hitler had won, but what I do want to argue here is that the actual result of this war, what actually happened, is arguably the worst tragedy in all of human history. It's the worst thing that has ever happened. So to sit here and say that, things turned out good in the end or something like that is entirely too blasé. And also this portrayal of the Allies as the good guys is very much too simplistic. Because don't forget, the Allies includes the Soviet Union, one of the most brutal, most repressive, most totalitarian, and most murderous governments in all of human history. And these were on the side of the supposed good guys. And on the side of the Axis, you also have the Finns, who are doing nothing but just defending their own territory from invasion by the Soviets. And it's very noticeable if you look at media portrayals of World War II, particularly from the Americans and the British, is that they all tend to really downplay the role that the Soviets played. Actually, the Soviets were enormously important to winning the war, and downplaying their role is just a propaganda decision during the Cold War, more or less. And similarly, this whole Winter War gets played down because it does not fit into this neat good versus evil dichotomy. Because if anything, if you just look at this one particular facet of the war, in this particular theater of the war, it really looks a lot like it's the Axis who are the good guys and the Allies who are the bad guys. So the actual history of World War II is a lot more complicated. Also, even if you just look at the Western Allies, there's also plenty of war crimes committed by the Allies. You have, of course, these fire bombings of various German cities, most notably Dresden. You have the nuclear weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, these were not attacks against military targets, which of course always bring with them certain amounts of civilian casualties. No, these were attacks against cities, against population centers, against the civilian population themselves. These were some of the most horrific acts carried out during the war, and they were carried out by the Western Allies. And this is true even when looking at the Germans themselves. Most of the German soldiers were not fighting in the war because they believed in the Nazi cause. No, they were fighting in the war because they were conscripted, because the penalty for dodging the draft was death. So it's not like they had much of a choice. And unlike World War I, there were very few people who actually volunteered to fight in the war. In World War I in Germany, as well as in other European countries, a lot of people who were gung-ho about this war and who were sort of excited to be able to fight for their fatherlands and so on. But at the start of World War II, World War I has only been over for about 20 years, so this was still fresh in the memory of people. The fathers of the people who signed up for World War II had fought in World War I, so they knew what this was about. They knew this was not going to be some sort of great romantic adventure. No, this was going to be death and slaughter and misery and suffering. Now, of course, if in the shoes of an Allied commander, you can't exactly go around and say, we're not going to shoot at the ordinary German soldiers because they're just conscripts. It's war. You have to kill these people on the battlefield. But nevertheless, it is every single life lost in that way is still tragic. And a great many lives were lost. We don't have any exact numbers, but probably more than 70 million people perished during this war, making it the bloodiest conflict in human history. So what do we actually get for these 70 million lives lost? Well, the war started out as a conflict over Eastern Europe. You have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, which in a secret protocol clarifies spheres of influence for Germany and the Soviet Union. Basically, what these two powers are doing is just dividing up significant parts of Eastern Europe between them. Part of that was Poland, which was to be divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany seizing the western part, and Soviet Union 2 weeks after the German invasion seizing the eastern part of Poland. And as a reaction to this Nazi invasion, Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later, on the 3rd of September 1939, which started the war proper. But of course, they were completely incapable of actually defending Poland. And so what happened at the end of the war was not that Eastern Europe was freed, was freed from the Nazis, but it was all seized by the Soviet Union. So in this war to protect Eastern Europe from being taken over by a brutal, repressive, and bloodthirsty dictatorship, instead Eastern Europe ended up in the hands of a different bloody, repressive, totalitarian dictatorship. I don't know if that's really much of an improvement. I don't know if it's really worth spending 70 million lives on that. And of course, on the Eastern Front, things were not much better. Yes, China was protected from being taken over by the Japanese Empire, but then immediately following World War II, you have this Chinese Civil War, in which eventually the communists win out, and China becomes a communist dictatorship under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And it's really not clear from the perspective of, let's say, the average Chinese peasant, whether it's preferable to be ruled by a Japanese empire or by Mao Zedong and his communist cronies. Because don't forget, Mao Zedong is the #1 mass murderer in all of human history. No one has killed more people than he has. So a war that weakens China to the point where someone like him can take over can hardly be considered a success. In the United States, in the present day, whenever someone criticizes the US Army, you can be sure that someone will trot out the tired old line that if it weren't for our troops, we'd all be speaking German right now. It's always struck me as kind of strange and funny that the #1 horror scenario for Americans is being able to speak a foreign language. But that's just me, I guess. But joking aside, this whole idea that Nazis would have taken over the entire world or something like that is completely absurd. No one in all of human history has ever managed to even conquer Europe or even come close to that. In fact, no one, with the exception of Australia, no one, no power, no empire, no king has ever managed to conquer any single continent or even come close to it. So this whole idea of the Nazis conquering the entire world, it's absurd. These empires, especially when they're these very quickly expanding empires that conquer a lot of territory in a short period of time, they're unstable. They collapse under their own weight and in a very short time in all cases. If you look at actually examples of long-lived empires, these are empires that slowly acquire the territory over a period of decades, of centuries, and who slowly integrated these new territories into their existing political system, like the Roman Empire that first started as a city-state, and then they incorporate the other territories in Italy, first as allies, and then later on these become citizens. and they have all these provinces that gradually get added on, and the people in those provinces gradually get more and more rights, and more of these people become Roman citizens. And in this way, this slow expansion, the slow Romanization of the empire, and this is the way you can develop a great empire. But of course, even the Roman Empire was, compared to the entire world, very small, and the Romans might have conquered a very large portion of the known world at the time, but then they didn't know very much about the world yet. They didn't know about the Americas. They had only the vaguest notions of the Far East and of Sub-Saharan Africa. Didn't know about Australia. Or if you look at the British Empire, this was an empire where a very advanced, very civilized, and very rich and powerful nation, namely the British, were able to conquer a whole bunch of much less advanced, much more primitive peoples. And yes, it's the greatest empire in all of history, the empire in which the sun never sets, and so on. But it was an empire that specifically, selectively preyed on societies that were a lot less advanced. The British did not conquer France or Spain or any of the German states or any of the other European powers. And no one at the time even thought it in any way realistic that the British would just conquer the rest of the world now that they controlled something like a quarter of it. The idea is absurd. It would never have happened. And similarly, the idea that the Germans could have just, after conquering Eastern Europe, just marched on and conquered the rest of the world, it's absurd. They tried to conquer Britain, or at least to deal enough damage to the British that they would withdraw from the war, and they failed that. So they failed this invasion, crossing a couple of kilometers of sea across the British Channel, but then you think they can just cross the Atlantic and conquer the United States. It's an absurd notion. And then, of course, there's the issue of the Holocaust, with roughly 6 million Jews being killed. The thing is, though, that the vast majority of that number were killed in the last couple of years of the war. Because, of course, Jews were persecuted by the Nazis even before the war, but it took more the form of... but this violence and oppression took a much less organized form. It was more a sort of mass boycott that was supported by the government. It was a matter of pushing Jews out of prestigious jobs. It was basically a matter of making life in Germany so unpleasant for Jews that they would just leave. The German government explicitly encouraged Jews to emigrate from Germany. The problem with this was that, first of all, some of the Jews just didn't want to leave, because Germany had been their home for many generations. And even for those who wanted to leave, it was very difficult, because other governments wouldn't take them, or would only take a very limited. But this sort of mass killing of Jews on an industrial scale, that's something that you only see in the last couple of years of the war. And of course, let's not forget about the other victims of the labor and death camps, the Slavs, the Roma, the communists, gay men, and so on, who also suffered or were killed in the concentration camps. And in that case, you see a ramp up during the war of the severity of the oppression and the killing. And by the way, in the case of homosexuals, they were actually, after they were freed from the camps, they were in many cases actually re-imprisoned by the Allies. While it probably must have been less bad to be imprisoned in, say, a British prison or camp compared to a German concentration camp, still it nicely illustrates this idea that the Western Allies were not necessarily the good guys. They were at most the less bad guys. So at the end of the day, what we're left with is a war where it's really not all that clear whether this decision by the Western Allies to enter this war or be involved with this war really improved anything, because it certainly didn't save Eastern Europe. I mean, it saved Eastern Europe from the Nazis, but let it fall into the hands of the communists, which really isn't much better. And it didn't really save very many Jews. I mean, the Nazis managed to exterminate something like 2/3 of the European Jewry. And sure, you can make the case that maybe if Britain and France hadn't gone to war against Germany, it might have been even worse, but then again, it might not have been. Maybe in a world where Germany and the Soviet Union just peaceably split up Eastern Europe between them, maybe in such a world, a lot fewer Jews would have been killed. You don't know that. I don't know that. No one knows. So this glorification of the Allies during World War II should stop. They were less bad than the Nazis, obviously, but that doesn't make them the good guys. That doesn't mean that they are these heroic paragons of virtue who should be emulated, who are the greatest generation or some nonsense like that. They were fighting against one of the most evil empires in human history. They were also fighting alongside one of the most evil empires in human history. They were flesh and blood people, good and bad among them, and we should stop putting them on a pedestal and instead try to understand the war and approach things with compassion and with an appreciation of this great tragedy, this greatest tragedy in human history. And we should mourn the losses on all sides, among soldiers, among civilians. Especially we should think of the Eastern Europeans, who besides the Jews are the primary victims of this greatest of wars, and who were grievously mistreated by both sides of this conflict. So hopefully in the future we're going to have a somewhat more nuanced conversation about World War II. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe down below and ring the bell button if you want to be certain to be notified when I release the next video. Until then, goodbye.